Thanks, Christoph. Happy to be here. Yes, so today we want to talk a little bit about AWS and cloud backends. So what do you need today to do anything cool? Except from the Kubernetes guy, they always need this Kubernetes stuff. You can do things without Kubernetes and without Docker. It's without Docker. Everything is just like serverless cloud AWS stuff. Okay, so what is the talk about? It's basically about AWS Amplify, which is one service that AWS offers. It's quite new, so it's only like a couple of years old, and it only got actually quite useful recently. So half a year, let's say a year ago, they added a lot of stuff, so it's actually pretty useful now. And so what does it do? It basically is it's not a service itself, it's more like a toolbox to access a lot of other different AWS services through one simple interface, and to very easily integrate these services into your app. So what does that mean? It has three main components. So the first thing is it offers some SDKs. For example, for all the major technologies, there is a Kotlin Java SDK for Android, there's a Swift SDK for iOS, there's a JavaScript SDK for all the web stuff, and I think there is also some other things like .NET and stuff like that, but these are the three main things, and we talk about Node.js today, so JavaScript is fine for us. Then they have a CLI, because yes, we know everything needs a CLI today. So the CLI is used to easily configure the services that you want to use in your app, and to just wire everything together. And last but not least, there are some UI components that they offer for common use cases like registration of users, login, or the user verification stuff like two-factor authentication, things like that. But also things like photo pickers that are then uploaded to an S3 bucket inside AWS. Things like that they already prepare for you, but you can also style them and use them how you wish. But all the base functionalities are already provided. So what do we have to do to use these services? We first start with the CLI. How do you get it? Yes, you install a Node.js package from NPM. There's the AWS Amplify CLI package that you can install on your machine. And then you just type amplify configure, which is a thing that you do once on your machine. And it basically sets up the, look at this. It sets up the region that you want to operate in for those who does, by the way, who does not know anything about AWS, or who doesn't know anything about AWS here. Okay, so for you, you have different regions in AWS, like where the data center is located, so you have to provide that. Then you add your username and your access credentials, and then you store that, and after that you can use these credentials to interact with the AWS account that you entered here, and do stuff there, add services, start things. Basically everything that you want to do. So you do that once, and then you can just use it in different projects. It also uses the AWS credentials that you set up with other methods like the normal AWS SDK. You can also use these. But that's just a very simple way to do that. I already did that, so I will not show that. And after that, you can, yes?
Is this a region where the data is stored, and also everything in the cloud is running physically and logically? Is that somehow separated from everything else?
Yes, they have separated data centers, and they do not interact with each other if you do not want them to. So
this is assured because cloud means.
Yes, it is cloud. So it means it runs in somebody else's data center, but the regions are actually separated. And there are actually some services that are only provided in some regions. So you might run into that if you, for example, try to use that new special service and it only runs on US East. So that's actually happening. Okay, so after we configured all the base stuff, we can start initializing our own project. And before we do that, we actually need a project. And I thought for this project, we just use the create React app. So that's first introductory project of React. Let's say MNUG, like this, demo. And we just install that. It's a very basic React application that just shows one simple screen. And using that application, we can show all the integrations that we could use with Amplify. So if we use yarn start here, we are not able to do that because, oh no, we don't have to install it. We just go into the folder and then use yarn start here. And then everything works fine. So we open the browser and we see the basic React app that you get when you install it. So it just shows the logo and some introduction. It also has hot reloading. So if I change the code, it automatically changes the website. So that makes it easier for us. And now we want to integrate Amplify into that project. And in order to do that, we just type in Amplify init inside the folder. Amplify is the CLI that I installed before. And if I use that, then it asks some questions, what I want to do. So what is the name of my project? It's the folder name. Then I just give him an environment. It's just like anything. You can give anything here. The AWS account I'm using here is the shared TNG playground for AWS. So it's not just me there. So the environment will help me to clean up afterwards. I can give him my editor because he also generates some editor config. Then he already detects what language I am in. So he detects, that's JavaScript. You might want to have the JavaScript SDK. It's actually React what you're using. It also has all the other frameworks that you might want to use. Then it detects the source directory, the build directory, build command, start command. That's it. Next thing is, do I want to use an AWS profile, which is basically a profile is one pair of credentials, and I could have different pairs on my machine. Like here, I'm using the TNG one. And now it initializes the project, not only on my machine, but also in the cloud, because some resources are already used or already needed for deployment, like one storage bucket where we could upload our infrastructure as code. We have some roles that I'm allowed to do all this stuff, and this is now started there. And after this is done, I have set up the Amplify framework inside my project, and I can then use it to integrate different things. Some of these I will show in my presentation now. So we have initialized the project. We told it what language we have and stuff like that. And now we can look at the SDK and what it actually allows us to do. So because we learned we have Amplify and we have configured it, but what does it actually give us? Quite a lot, actually. I just will skip that for a moment. That's the basic building parts of AWS Amplify. Some of the main ones are the API here, the authentication. So we have some kind of APIs that we can spawn. We have some kind of authentication, user authentication that we can get from here. We have some storage, some analytics stuff. Also some helpful things like caching or we have some pub sub WebSocket things. So these are all the things that we will get, and we will try out some of these in this talk. The first one I want to talk about is API. And if I talk about API here, I actually mean two different things. So the two main AWS services you will get with Amplify is, on the one hand, API gateways, which is basically HTTP, REST, things like that. And on the other hand, AppSync, which is the GraphQL endpoint of AWS. So it's like a managed, hosted GraphQL where you just put your schema and some resolver there, and then AWS does everything for you. And for this talk, I will use the left part, so the REST backend, and just integrate that into the project we just created. And in order to do that, there's a simple command that we use with our CLI. So we just type amplify add API. And now it also, again, asks us some questions. So in this case, we want to have a REST API. We give it some friendly name. It's very friendly, so you use that one. I can configure my endpoint. In this case, I will just use the items one. Then I create a new Lambda function, which will basically run an node.js Express web server, which will be auto-generated for me. We can look at this, at the result of it in a moment. We give it a friendly name, a function name, and now it has two different templates that we can use for our endpoint. One of these, is it too far down? Okay. One is to use CRUD functionality with an Amazon DynamoDB database table. So you just have create, read, update, delete for your data, and it automatically provides the database that it will be stored in. You have read functionality and write functionality, and everything will be there, which is the one that we will use for now. Now it asks us, do you have a data source already, or do you want to create a new one? In this case, we want to create a new one. We give it a friendly name, a friendly table name. And now I want to provide the data type that I want to store. So it's basically the schema of the data I want to store. In this case, the first column will be some ID column with data type number. And I want to add another table column, which will be called data, and it will be a string. I don't want to add another table. Then I have to tell him what's the primary key of your table. Do you want to have a sort key? No. Do you want to have a global secondary index? No, because we don't need that. Do you want to access other resources? No. Do you want to edit the lambda function? No. Do we want to restrict the API access? That's something interesting, because this kind of needs some type of authentication. So if we want the API to be restricted, then we need some kind of user authentication and registration and login and things like that. And I'd say yes, we want that. So we just tell them yes, we want to restrict the API access to authenticated users only. And what do these authenticated users, what should they be allowed to do? I just say everything. They are allowed to do everything. And that's basically the first endpoint. We have items. They have an ID and data as fields. And the API is restricted to authenticated users. So we are done here. And this is basically the configuring that we did right now. And now we have to get all this config to the cloud. And to achieve this, we just type in amplify push, which will give us a list of what it will do. In this case, we will add a storage thing, in this case a DynamoDB table, we will add a function, so a Lambda function. We will add authentication and an API. Enter. And now it will start deploying all the things that we need to provide all these things to AWS. It will take some time, so I will just go back to the slides for now. Okay, so it was actually pretty easy to just type in some commands, and now the backend or the CloudFormation infrastructure as a code thing from AWS does its job and will create these resources. So apart from the API, there are some other things that we can achieve with Amplify. We will look into how the API will be used in a moment. We have to wait for the deployment. So how will it be used? We have this SDK that we will use in a moment that we can then use to interact with the API. Some other things that that Amplify provides us is, for example, hosting. So since we're developing a React app, we also want to host our front end somewhere, because now we have a backend, but we want to host a front end somewhere. And in this case, we can also use Amplify to just create an S3 bucket that contains the static files, and you can use that for HTTP website connections. And if you want the content delivery network and HTTPS encryption, things like that, then you can optionally add the CloudFront, which is the content delivery network of AWS, to your configuration, and then this will manage all the certificate, domain, endpoint, DNS stuff. No, DNS not, but everything from there will be managed by it. We will use that later as well. So it's just as simple as the other one, Amplify add hosting, and you have a choice to use it just for dev, so just the bucket, or for prod with the delivery network. And one thing that we implicitly used already is the authentication. Since we wanted to restrict our API, we added that behind the scenes. But that's actually a module that you can add explicitly as well. So authentication is basically two things. There are two main AWS services. You notice there are a lot of AWS services in general, so one for everything. In this case, we have two. The one is called Cognito, and the other one is called IAM. IAM is the identity and access management, so it's basically providing all the permissions, the roles, who is allowed to do what. Is basically everything is defined in the IAM. And Cognito is kind of the user database, user storage. So Cognito does know who your users are, so it does know the email address and is it verified and what's the name and things like that. And IAM knows what these users are allowed to do. In our case, IAM knows that these users are allowed to interact with our API, and Cognito knows who is actually who does actually create users in our application. So these are the two parts. I will skip that. And one thing how you can use it is you can just go there and import the SDK for authentication, and then just type in auth sign up, provide some username, password attributes, and then it creates users, and in the same way you can just sign in with the username and password, and then it will just tell you yes, that worked, or no, it didn't, or you need to do some email verification stuff. That's one way, but the other way is even cooler, and that's the one I will show right now, since I hope that the deployment is done. Yes, it is done. All resources are updated in the cloud. Perfect. So just to get back what we already have, We just look at the Amplify status. We have storage, we have the function, we have authentication, and we have an API. Now we want to use all of these things in our application. And to do that, I will just open the application in my IDE, like this, and I will use the presentation mode to make it easier for you to read it. Okay, so one thing we notice is that we have some Amplify folder in here, which contains a lot of stuff, which is basically all the things that we just did, auto-generated, all the templates that will that have been deployed to the cloud. We can just ignore that. Instead, we will look at the source code, and in our case, the app.js, which is basically the same application that we have just seen. So we will just go back to the terminal for a second and use yarn start again. Just see the website again. So it looked like this. We have some icon. First of all, we have to install the packages for that. So we want to yarn add Aws Amplify, which is the SDK, and then Amplify React, which is the React components for Aws Amplify. And just wait for it to install, and start the server again. Now we can start the live coding. Just wait for the indexing, and now we can just type in with authentication our app, and it's not called authentication but authenticator. We import it from Aws Amplify React, and that's basically everything we had to do. Since now we reload it, and we see a login screen. So it did something, and okay, I can just try if my Amazon credentials work here. No, authentication error. Okay. Huh. Good thing is there is a create account button in down here, so we can just use that to create a user with some password and my email address, since it has to be verified. I know that the phone number will not be verified, so I will not use mine. And now we create an account, and authentication error. Very good. That we want him to tell us, since we didn't create the users yet. And if I now enter all the stuff here and create my account, it will ask me to confirm my sign up with a confirmation code, which is promptly sent to my email here. Perfect. We use that. And now we can log in. And now we see our website. And there's even one cooler thing that we want to use. If we put true here, it will even give us a header that will show us the user that is currently logged in, and even provides us with some sign out button. So perfect, we now have user authentication. And since this backend is already running in AWS, we can use the user wherever we want. And if we provide the front end somewhere, we can actually access it from everywhere. And since we are authenticated now, we can actually use the API that we provided before. And so what we want to do is we want some possibility to add some data, to put some data into the backend, and then to get it out again. And in order to do that, I will just add some input field here, like this. It has an on change method, and we need some state here, so I will just use the use state from the React hooks like this. So we have some data. We have the method set data. In this case, we want to get the target value of this field and want to write it into our data. So now we store the things that we write into this input field, and now we want to have a button that will put the data. And on click, it will call the put data method, which will be up here, like this. And so now we have some data, and we want to store it in the cloud. We just use the API SDK up here, and in this case, the put functionality, so we want to add things to the cloud. And now we look at the signature, and first of all, it wants our API name. The API name, it was auto-generated before. It is actually the thing that's in the config under AWS Cloud Logic custom name. And since we already imported the config, we can just use that. So let's say API name equals AWS exports Cloud Logic at position 0.name, like this, and enter it here. The next one was the path, which we called items before, and now we want some config, or the rest of the data which will be the body, and this is now the element that we want to store. In our case, it has some ID and some data. Okay, we didn't provide the ID yet. In this case, we just use like math.random times 10,000, and we just wrap it with a math.floor to make it integers. Yes, so this thing is async, so we will await it. But after that, we will hopefully have an input box and some put data button. And if I say hello MNUG here and press put data, nothing happens because we didn't tell him to do anything. But if we look at the network tab, we see that there's some requests going out, and in this case, a put request to the items endpoint, and it has some data down here, which is the data that we filled in, and some ID. And the response just tells us, yes, put call success.
Where do you configure that?
Huh?
Where's the response configured?
Oh, we can look at that in a second. We will now use this ID, since it is there now. Is it actually, so we saw some request. Did it actually store it in the database? So we just duplicate the button. We say, it has a get data method now. So const get data, and get data will use the API, and in our case we now don't want to use put but get. Move that up here. So we again use the API name. Now we want to use the items and the ID endpoint. So we want to get a single item. And yes, if we just call it like that, we can await. This is the item. It's actually not an array, so I just use items. And invalid number of arguments. Okay, we just give it like that. But now we can just use the set data method that we already have, which will set the data up here, to just use items on the position 0.data, and use it as a value down here. So what it should do now is if we click that button, it will send a GET request to our API for this ID, get the data back, and put it inside the input box. And since we have hot reloading, the thing is already empty. So if we click here and wait a second, then the data is there. So it actually seems to be stored somewhere. And everything worked, so we did store data into the backend, and then we got it out again. So that's pretty cool, and this was like in 20 minutes or something like that, with youth authentication. Okay, so that's the API, and now, of course, we want to use, everybody of us wants to use this awesome app, so let's host it. And how do we do that? We learned that before. We just do amplify add hosting. We want it to do def hosting. We want to give it a friendly name. It has an index HTML, and that's it. And now we don't want to use the, we could use amplify push that we used before, but in this case, we not only want to change the backend, but we also want to push our front end into the backend to serve it to all of you. So in this case, we want to use the amplify publish command, publish, like this, which will first show me all the things that it will do. It says, okay, no changes to the stuff we already know, but we want to create hosting. Let's do that. And it will, again, walk to the AWS data store, data center, and add some things. In this case, a bucket to store the website, and some rules to interact with that. In the meantime, we can just look at the code that provided the responses, which is somewhere down here in the backend, in the API, no, in the function actually. There's down there's the name of the lambda, and there's a source, and there is a Node.js application, which is some AWS serverless express thing, which will load some app. And this is actually a lot of code, which was auto-generated. And it provides all the endpoints that we saw before. We have the get method of a single object. We have a put method for inserting object. Here's also the put call succeeded that we've seen before. So if we get something in here, we check if the user is already there. If not, then we use DynamoDB to put the data into the table. If we have some errors, we will return that. Otherwise, it will succeed. So that's the basic thing that happens there. That's just plain Node.js with a little bit of AWS SDK. And the same with post, where you want to update things, and delete to delete things. And you can take these functions and just edit them if you want to. So it's actually pretty perfect to use that as a starting point, and then just go from there and add your own stuff. And in the meantime, this one popped up, and this is actually some globally reachable domain hosting bucket thing on AWS. And since it uses the same backend as we used before, we can just use the same user and log in with that and see our website, and we can even get the data and see the data that we entered before. But you don't have to believe me. We can just use a QR code, and you can try it out yourself, like this. I'll do the same, like this. And you have the UI here. I can even log in with my account.
What's your password?
Tja. I have it here, so that's the same URI. You can register with your own account. It has a register button, so you can register your own user, and it even has the email authentication verification. So that's the hosting, and another thing that the last thing I want to show is interesting. Now that you all use this application, I want to know how many of you are using it and what you are doing on the application. So we want some kind of analytics. And in order to do that, we can use Amplify again. Of course, Amplify, add analytics, like this. And the analytics service is actually a service called Pinpoint, which provides some basic analytics functionality, like tracking how many users are returning, how often, and what do they do. So it's like a basic version of Google Analytics, let's say it like that. We have to give it some pinpoint. Just use the record method. I can then record arbitrary events. In this case, get data called like this. And it will just send this event to the backend every time somebody clicks that button. And one thing I also want to do is to enable so-called auto tracking, which will just track the basic functionality, like how many people do visit and how often do they return, how many sessions do they create, things like that. And now we just use Amplify Publish again to, on the one hand, create new things in the backend, in this case the analytics endpoint, and on the other hand upload our front end with the changes that we just did to actually track these events. And it should go pretty quick. In the meantime, you can just look which slides I have left. In this case, okay, we have analytics here. Pinpoint is a service. You can just use it in the code as we just did. One thing that is left that I will not show is storage. Okay, we have seen that we have DynamoDB as a storage. You can also use S3 for binary data. So we can just go in our code to like storage.put, storage.put, give it a name and a content, and you upload it, and then you can get it again later. So like profile, images, avatars, or things like that, you can upload with that. Okay, do we have a backend already? No, still creating. Okay, so we looked at the major things that Amplify provides us. We have seen some APIs, or one API that we created. We have seen some authentication together with the prepared components that Amplify already created for us. We have seen some, or we will see some analytics. We have already added it. We have some storage with the DynamoDB. There's also like some bot technology, some WebSocket things. You can push notifications to your users, and there are some helpers like translation, logging, and service worker helpers that just make things easier. And for the UI components, we have already seen the registration. There's also some additional screens that we did not see, like two-factor authentication, where you have to scan the QR code and then type it into your type the number that you create on your phone back into the website to verify that you use or that you have this second factor. And there are also, as I said, some things like photo pickers and stuff like that. Okay, so now we still have to wait for this guy. It will only take a couple more hours, I guess. No, I think it will be done in a second. Yes?
Quick question. Don't you have to initialize the analytics service in the React app?
I think we did that. It's this line that we added here. With what?
With credentials?
Oh, that's actually done by all the Amplify configure up here. Amplify configure also does things like provide a guest account for you as soon as you go onto the website, and yeah, also wires together all the basic things. Like if we look back into the config file here, for example, the Cognito user pool, which will store all your users, is configured in here, or the DynamoDB table is configured in here, and in this case the content delivery bucket, which will contain the storage. But in our case, the Cognito thing is interesting, and okay, we've seen it now. There is actually the mobile analytics app ID automatically inserted here, and this app ID will now be used by the analytics SDK to provide all the analytics stuff. Okay, we deployed. We can now click this button sometimes, and if we go back to the terminal, we also see that it provides us with some endpoint where we can see the data. We just go there. No, that's not the endpoint. The endpoint is not in the deployment of the front end, but in the deployment of the back end, of course. So like this. No, that's actually the wrong browser. Let's use this one. Like this. And we see we already have some data. It didn't update the numbers up here, but the graph already shows, we have two active endpoints here. I can just refresh here my website on the mobile device again, and then we should see that it increases here. I have to admit the data is at least some minutes slower than real time, so we have to wait some time to actually see things here. But it's actually pretty nice to just throw it in and it works, and you don't have to do anything. We have some basic things. We also have the events here, which is the thing that we added manually, which is get data called. And if we click at it, we can see how often is it called by which user, and yeah, to do some basic analytics there. So in this case, we see, on the Wednesday, the September 25th, somebody clicked that button 4 times, or the button was clicked 4 times, let's say like that. And okay, we have typically 1.3 events per session and things like that. So that's the analytics stuff, and that's actually the last thing I wanted to show you. So I'm through with my stuff, and I'm happy to answer your questions.